Before Rome raised temples or marched armies, it had something more powerful: land. A place where rivers carved through valleys, where hills rose like shields, and where the soil whispered of grain, grapes, and empire. The Tiber River became the spine of Rome. It gave water, trade, and defense. The early people settled on its banks, not with palaces, but with simple huts, stone tools, and quiet purpose. 7 hills surrounded Rome like a natural fortress. From these heights, shepherds and farmers once watched the land, never guessing they stood where emperors would one day rule the world. Agriculture shaped Roman values: discipline, routine, and respect for labor. Olive trees rooted deep into the hills. Wheat fields turned sweat into bread, and bread into strength. Rome grew not by accident, but by advantage. Its central location allowed connection to trade, to other tribes, to opportunity. Rome was placed to grow, and taught itself how. Rome's early leaders weren't emperors. They were kings, warriors, and farmers. They didn't rule with marble. They ruled with mud, sweat, and blood. Before empire came survival. Rome fought neighbors for land, water, and pride. Each battle taught them not just how to win, but how to endure. And as victories came, so did roads. Dirt paths widened into gravel lanes. What began as a foot trail became the arteries of empire. The land taught Rome to be stubborn. The sun scorched, the hills resisted, but Rome adapted, and in adapting, it survived. The world remembers Roman armies and emperors. But before legions marched, before statues stood, there was only the land, and Rome listened. Before Rome became marble and gold, it was brick and clay. Life in the city was crowded, dusty, and loud. Chickens walked the alleys, children played beside carts, and smoke rose from open-air kitchens. Homes were not palaces. Most lived in insula, stacked apartments with creaking wood floors and shared water basins. Heat lingered in the walls, rats in the corners, yet this was the heart of the city. In the morning, the streets woke early. Vendors shouted, bakers lit fires, slaves hauled water, and the first rays of sun reached across stone roofs to touch the temple domes. Meals were simple: porridge, olives, lentils, and bread. Salted fish if lucky. For most, meat was rare. Wealth was tasted in wine, not feasts. Cleanliness came from the baths, but not from luxury. Romans gathered in steam-filled halls of stone, scraping sweat with metal tools, sharing gossip beneath dripping ceilings. Clothing was simple: wool tunics, leather sandals, and cloaks to guard against rain. The poor wore what they could. The rich wore what others made. At the center of each home, no matter how poor, was the hearth. A clay lamp, a family offering, a small statue of the household gods. The fire was life and prayer. Children played with carved bones, sticks, and coins. Boys learned letters if their family could afford it. Girls watched their mothers and learned by doing. Evenings brought calm. Merchants closed stalls. Firelight flickered in windows. Neighbors shared wine under fading skies. Rome, for a brief hour, was quiet. Life in ancient Rome was not grand for most, but it was full of work, of laughter, of belief. In the clay and ash, the Roman soul burned steadily. Rome's strength was not in numbers, but in structure. The Roman legion was a machine of discipline, built from farmers, laborers, and common men, forged into one will. Each soldier carried his world: shield, gladius, water flask, grain. They built their own camps, dug trenches, and fought in silence. War was labor, and labor was sacred. Commands came not from shouting, but from signal, horns, standards, and formation. Roman tactics weren't glorious. They were patient, brutal, and precise. Centurions led from the front. Their crested helmets marked them as guides and threats. They punished slackers, praised courage, and died first. Before the battle, silence. Soldiers sharpened blades, mended leather, whispered prayers. They knew that war was not for glory, but for survival, order, and Rome. The gladius was short, but deadly. Made for thrusting in tight lines, it turned men into machines. No flourishes, just the forward step and the strike. Victories were marked not by monuments, but by boots in mud. Rome conquered by digging more, marching longer, and bleeding slower than its enemies. After the battle came the camp. Fires, silence, and the writing of names, those who lived, those who died. A Roman soldier left no grave unmarked. A veteran carried scars, not medals. His reward was land, a worn sword, and the respect of those who watched him walk without fear. The Roman military was not born for glory. It was born to last. Built by men who shaped empire with their hands, their shields, and their silence. Rome was more than swords and stones. It had a soul. In temples and scrolls and statues and silence, Rome kept a conversation with the divine, the eternal, and the unknown. Roman gods lived in streets and kitchens. They weren't distant. They watched from hearths, guarded doorways, and whispered in firelight. Temples rose not to impress, but to remind of order, fate, and gratitude. The gods were many, but all demanded the same: respect, ritual, and remembrance. Philosophy in Rome was not just read, it was lived. Stoics spoke of duty, restraint, and death without fear. To be Roman was to hold silence heavier than praise. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and thinker, wrote his meditations not for glory but for himself. In tents beside battlefields, under stormlit skies, he reflected on virtue, time, and purpose. Art was not luxury, it was memory. In painted walls and carved stone, Romans told stories, not just of gods and kings, but of bakers, builders, lovers, and loss. Education was slow and precious. Boys learned to read Latin by wax tablet and whispered verse. Girls, if fortunate, learned the rhythms of story and sound. Poets sang of war and wine. Ovid, Virgil, Horace, they weren't just writers. They were architects of emotion, turning Roman experience into eternal rhythm. Even gladiators were part of the myth. Death became theater, pain became politics. Rome stared into blood and saw identity. To understand Rome is to see beyond the marble. It is to hear the thoughts unspoken, the prayers burned in smoke, the knowledge carved in silence. That too was power. Rome's first kings fell, not by blade but by idea. The Republic rose with a promise that no man would be king again. Power would be shared, balanced, restrained. 2 consuls led the state, elected to serve and to limit one another. They wore the same tunic, carried the same burden, and stepped aside when time expired. Senators gathered not in silence, but in thunder. Debate echoed through stone halls. Old men in worn robes argued the fate of empires with cracked voices and sharp hands. But the Republic was never equal. Patricians ruled, plebeians endured. The people protested in muddy streets while nobles whispered in columns and coin. To keep peace, Rome made compromise law. Tribunes were chosen by the people, guardians of rights, but even justice wore armor in Rome. Politics in Rome was a battleground of words. Alliances shifted like sand. Honor and betrayal walked side by side, cloaked in white linen. Elections were loud, bought, and rarely fair. Voters swayed by bread, wine, and promise. Rome's democracy breathed, but not without cost. And yet, despite its flaws, the Republic expanded. It forged law, built roads, raised armies, and inspired fear. It endured because it adapted and never slept. But ambition has a voice, and Rome began to listen. Generals returned home not as servants of the state, but as masters of loyalty. The Republic, though strong, trembled. Beneath marble statues and noble oaths, Rome was changing, and the knife of civil war waited quietly in the crowd. It began not with swords, but with silence. A silence that settled over Rome like dust, thick, uneasy, waiting. The Republic, once founded on shared power and noble law, now trembled beneath the weight of ambition. Julius Caesar did not return as a servant of the state. He returned as a storm. With the loyalty of battle-hardened legions, he crossed the Rubicon, a shallow stream that became a border between past and future. In that crossing, Rome's fate changed forever. The Senate, once the beating heart of Roman order, panicked. Old men in white robes debated behind closed doors while soldiers marched in the streets. Friends turned to enemies, laws bent like reeds in wind. But Caesar moved without hesitation. He offered peace, spoke of reform, wrapped his ambition in the language of the Republic, and the people believed him. He fed the hungry. He gave land to the poor. He celebrated victory with parades, games, and gold. And Rome, weary of chaos, embraced his calm. But power is never silent. It whispers in corners, it sharpens fear into steel. And in the great marble hall of the Senate, on the Ides of March, Julius Caesar fell, not to enemies, but to allies. Men who had dined with him, marched beside him, wept for his triumphs, now struck him down beneath the statue of Pompey. They called it justice. They called it salvation. But it was the beginning of the end. Because what followed was not order, it was fury. Civil war tore across provinces like wildfire. The Republic bled on fields, in homes, in hearts. And from the ashes rose another name, Octavian. Caesar's adopted son, calm, young, unassuming, but with the mind of a fox and the patience of a shadow. He joined with generals, destroyed his rivals, and slowly, step by step, became the master of all Rome. But he did not declare himself king. No, he was cleverer than that. He took the title first citizen. He kept the Senate, the courts, the temples. But behind the curtain, he ruled it all. The Republic had not died in battle. It had quietly fallen asleep, lulled by titles, by rituals, by the illusion of choice. And when Rome finally awoke, it was an empire. Rome had seen blood. It had seen betrayal, chaos, and civil war. But when Octavian became Augustus, it saw something new: order. He did not rise with thunder. He rose with silence. No grand coronation, no broken chains, just stability. After decades of wounds, Rome craved it more than freedom. Augustus knew it. He spoke softly. He called himself a servant of the people. But every road, every law, every soldier now answered to him. He repaired temples crumbling from neglect. He rebuilt streets where chaos once marched. He reformed the tax system, reshaped the army, revived ancient traditions, and the people cheered, not for a king, but for peace. For bread that arrived on time, for streets free of riot, for water that flowed through aqueducts with unshakable rhythm. Under Augustus, art flourished, poetry found new breath. Virgil wrote of Rome's divine mission. Horace sang of balance and duty. Ovid whispered of love and rebellion. Marble replaced brick. Statues lined every road. Gods and emperors stood side by side. But beneath the surface, every creation whispered the same message. Rome is eternal. And Rome began to believe it. Borders stretched from Britain to Egypt. Legions patrolled deserts, forests, rivers, and mountains. Roads carved across continents. Merchants moved safely. Messages arrived faster than ever before. A citizen could walk for weeks across provinces and still feel the weight of Rome beneath his sandals. But Augustus understood. Power must be disguised. He kept the Senate, but it bowed. He held elections, but they confirmed. He preserved the old words while rewriting their meanings. Rome was still a republic in name, but in spirit it had become something else. An empire of order, of spectacle, of masks. Augustus never called himself a god. Yet when he died, temples rose in his honor. His body was burned, but his name stayed carved in stone. And Rome, in mourning, did not weep for a man. It wept for a father, a savior, a myth. For with Augustus, Rome had been reborn. But myths are fragile, and empires do not rest forever. At its height, Rome ruled not just land, but imagination. From the green hills of Britannia to the burning sands of Africa, from the mountains of Hispania to the marble shores of Greece, all bowed to one banner, SPQR. The sun never set on Roman ambition. Roads stretched like veins, cities bloomed where there was once only rock. Soldiers spoke Latin in a dozen accents, trade flourished. Olive oil from the east, wine from Gaul, silk from far beyond, everything passed through Rome's hands. And in return, Rome gave law, aqueducts, amphitheaters, order. A blueprint for civilization carved in stone and blood. In the cities, life moved with rhythm. Theaters echoed with drama. Markets overflowed with color and noise. In the countryside, farmers worked lands protected by distant legions. Taxes paid for temples. Temples paid for legacy. The emperors that followed Augustus, some ruled with wisdom, others with wrath. Tiberius hid in shadows. Caligula turned madness into policy. But then came men like Trajan, who stretched the empire farther than ever, or Hadrian, who built walls not to conquer but to define. Each left behind more than decisions. They left symbols, stories, warnings. Rome became more than a city. It became an idea of control, of structure, of pride. But ideas can harden. Rome's strength turned into arrogance. Its victories bred enemies. Its walls grew tall, but inside, cracks began to form. The poor grew poorer. The rich grew fewer. Citizenship became currency. Loyalty became transaction. Bread and circuses masked unrest. Gladiators died as crowds cheered, not knowing the empire that gave them games was slowly bleeding beneath their feet. Still, Rome endured. That was its gift, endurance. While others broke, Rome adapted. But even the strongest stone wears thin when rain never stops falling. Decline is never loud. It creeps, like a shadow at dusk, long before anyone notices the light is fading. Rome still looked like Rome. Marble temples, grand processions, legions marching in step. But something had changed. The heart of the empire beat slower. The people grew tired. The gods felt distant. Corruption spread through the Senate like mold and stone. Offices were bought, not earned. Justice bent toward gold, not truth. The emperors came faster now, some lasting months, others just days. Praetorian guards once protected, now they played kingmaker. Taxes rose, harvests failed, roads broke down. The frontiers were no longer lines of strength, but scars under siege. Germanic tribes pressed in from the forests. The east stirred with rebellion. And still, Rome whispered to itself, "We are eternal." To calm unrest, the emperors built more games, more baths, more spectacles. But the crowds cheered with dull eyes. Bread filled bellies, but not hope. Citizenship was handed out like coins. But what did it mean now to be Roman? To serve a name that had forgotten your voice? Even the army changed. Fewer Romans wore the armor. Mercenaries stood in ranks paid in gold, loyal only to gold. The provinces grew restless. In Africa, whispers of independence. In Gaul, of kings returning. And in the east, Constantinople rose, bright, strong, and proud. A second Rome, built as the first quietly cracked. But Rome did not fall in a day. It did not burn in a single night. It drifted, slipped, diminished, while its people clung to statues, stories, and the dream that tomorrow would still belong to them. The end did not arrive with fire. It came with silence. In the West, emperors were no longer chosen. They were appointed, betrayed, forgotten. Rome itself, once heart of the world, grew hollow. Walls cracked, statues crumbled, fountains ran dry. The people stayed, but the dream of empire had already left. Barbarian warlords, once feared, now neighbors, walked Roman streets not as conquerors but as heirs. In 476 AD, the last emperor of the West was deposed. A boy with no armies, no legacy, just a crown too heavy for time. Rome had fallen. But had it? The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, still stood, a mirror of Rome across the sea. And beyond borders, Rome survived in memory, in language, in law, in stone. Medieval kings called themselves Caesars. Cathedrals rose on Roman ruins. Roads built by forgotten hands still bore new footsteps. Latin lived on in silence, on scrolls, in scriptures, in the whisper of science and prayer. Rome became more than place. It became pattern, a ghost in every capital, a shadow in every flag, a question carved into the bones of Europe. What is power? What is legacy? What lasts? Because Rome did fall, but in falling, it was remembered, and sometimes to become eternal, a thing must first be broken. They called it New Rome. A city born not from conquest, but from memory. Constantinople, where East met West, where emperors still wore purple, and where the spirit of Rome refused to die. When the Western Empire crumbled, Constantinople stood tall, stone walls unbroken, gold glimmering across its domes, the sea whispering promise at its feet. This was not the Rome of the Senate and Forum. This was a Rome reborn in marble, cloaked in silk, and defended by flame. The Byzantines, children of Caesar and Christ, wrote laws with ink and blood. They spoke Latin, then Greek. They prayed in incense, and they ruled with divine right, not mortal vote. Justinian rose like a flame in the dark. He dreamed not of preserving Rome, but of restoring it. He sent armies to reclaim lost lands, Africa, Italy, even the eternal city itself. But his greatest conquest was invisible: law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian, outlived the man, the city, the empire. It became the backbone of justice in lands he'd never see. Yet glory came at a cost. Plague swept the streets, turning marble white into silence. Rebellions burned from within. And the great dome of Hagia Sophia, though magnificent, echoed with prayers from a people growing weary. Still, Constantinople endured. Behind its triple walls, it stood as the last light of Rome. Its mosaics shimmered in candlelight. Its scholars copied forgotten books. While Europe slept in shadows, Byzantium remembered. But memory is not immortality, and faith alone cannot hold empires. Enemies gathered: Persians, Arabs, Crusaders. The city held for centuries, but even stone weathers. And yet, even when the Turks breached its walls in 1453, even when the last emperor died sword in hand, refusing to flee, even when the bells fell silent and the cross was lowered, Rome did not vanish. Because Byzantium, like Rome before it, left more than ruins. It left rhythm, architecture, icons, echoes. It left a warning carved into time: what we build with power crumbles, what we build with meaning endures. They say empires die, but Rome never truly did. It changed names, faces, and faiths, but its shadow stretched across centuries and across the sea. When the Western Empire fell to ruin, its monuments cracked and its marble was scavenged for firewood. But far to the east a new city glittered: Constantinople, city of Constantine, cradle of a second chance. Perched on the meeting point of continents, guarded by water and stone, Constantinople was more than a city. It was a statement, a declaration that Rome, though bloodied, was not broken. Here, emperors still wore crowns shaped like halos. Here, law still spoke Latin. And yet, something was different. The Byzantines did not look westward for their soul. They looked to heaven. They saw the emperor not merely as ruler, but as God's chosen hand on earth. Where once Roman generals earned power through conquest, now divine favor shaped destiny. And in golden churches, where light spilled through mosaics like liquid fire, faith became politics, and politics became faith. The man who dared to shape this vision into reality was Justinian I. Born in obscurity, trained in discipline, he rose not through war but through law, logic, and relentless ambition. He did not dream small, he dreamed of the impossible. He would restore the Roman Empire, not in memory but in blood and stone. His armies marched westward. Belisarius, his loyal general, reclaimed Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Goths, and even stood once more in the streets of Rome itself. But these victories, though glorious, were costly. The empire bled gold and men. Cities were burned to be rebuilt. Fields were salted to be defended. Justinian saved Rome's body, but strained Byzantium's heart. Yet while his generals fought abroad, Justinian forged a legacy far greater than any battlefield. The law. The corpus juris civilis, the body of civil law, was born from chaos. It gathered, corrected, and unified centuries of Roman legislation. It preserved justice, clarified power, defined property, and it would echo through Europe for more than 1,000 years, long after Byzantium's towers fell. But even emperors who rule with vision cannot control the plague. In 541, a sickness came, not with armies, but with rats. Ships arrived in harbors with silence below deck. And then the bodies came. They died in alleys, in churches, in the palaces themselves. No one was spared, not nobles, not priests, not generals. The air grew heavy with incense and despair. Justinian himself fell ill. For weeks, the empire teetered on collapse. And though he recovered, something in the city broke. Faith remained, but joy withered. People spoke more of saints than soldiers, more of judgment than justice. And still the city endured. Because Constantinople was not just stone and spirit, it was will. It rebuilt after riots, it resisted invasion, it buried its dead, and marched forward. For centuries it stood as the shining gate between east and west, between heaven and earth. But the world was changing, and no wall, no matter how high, can hold back time. But time is not kind to empires built on memory. After Justinian, Byzantium faced a truth Rome had ignored, that glory is heavy and memory does not defend walls. Enemies encircled the empire like wolves in the dark. From the east came the Persians, ancient rivals with long memories and sharper swords. To the west, former allies grew restless. The Lombards seized Italy, the Slavs crossed the Danube, and soon from the south came something entirely new: Islam. Swift, devout, unified. The Arab armies burst forth with fire and verse. They swept across Persia, then Syria, then Egypt. In less than a century, the old Roman provinces that once defined civilization bowed to a new world, one carried not by emperors, but by the word of a prophet. Byzantium reeled, Damascus was lost, Alexandria too. The granaries of the empire, the breadbasket of its survival, slipped into foreign hands, but Constantinople stood. And when the Arab fleet came, it came with fire and faith. But Byzantium had secrets. Greek fire, a weapon of myth and terror, a flame that burned on water, clung to ships like judgment, and turned the sea itself into a battlefield. Its formula was a closely guarded secret, lost now to history. But in its time, it saved a city and an empire. The siege was broken, the fleet burned, and the world learned a new truth. Constantinople did not fall easily. But the empire that emerged was not the same as before. It was leaner, sharper, more Eastern, more Christian. Gone were many of the old Roman forms. Latin faded from court, icons replaced statues, processions replaced parades, and within the city's heart a new crisis brewed, not of soldiers, but of saints. The iconoclast controversy. Should images of Christ and the saints be worshipped, or were they false idols, shadows of true divinity? Emperors clashed with monks, churches were stripped, icons were smashed with hammers. For a century, Byzantium waged war not against outsiders, but against itself. Blood was spilled not for territory, but for theology. It was a war of meaning, of memory, of how to see the divine. And though the icons would one day return, the cracks remained. Faith had once united Byzantium, now it divided. Yet even through this, the empire survived. That was Byzantium's greatest power, not victory, but survival. New dynasties rose, some brought peace, others brought ruin. One emperor blinded his brothers, another married a tavern dancer and ruled wisely, another built churches with gold stolen from his own army. Through it all, Constantinople endured, gleaming, trembling, whispering to the world that Rome still lived. Its markets bustled, its scholars preserved ancient texts, its ships crossed the Black Sea and the Aegean. Pilgrims came to see the relics. Spices, silk, and silver passed through its gates. And on Sundays, as the Hagia Sophia filled with golden light and haunting chants, it felt for a moment as if heaven itself had bent to kiss the earth. But storms do not sleep forever. To the north, the Bulgars grew bold. To the west, the Franks declared a new Roman emperor, Charlemagne, mocking Byzantium's legacy. And to the east, old empires waited, watching, listening. The empire had survived plague, fire, heresy, and war, but its greatest test was yet to come. The 11th century began with gold and ended in blood. For a time, Byzantium found strength in a new dynasty, the Macedonian emperors. Under Basil II, called the Bulgar Slayer, the empire stretched wide again. He was a soldier's emperor, silent, severe, unforgiving. He ruled for nearly 50 years, longer than any emperor before him. He crushed uprisings, disciplined the court, and broke the power of the Bulgarian kingdom to the north. When his armies returned, they carried not spoils, but prisoners, thousands of them. He ordered each group of 100 to be blinded, leaving one man in every group with a single eye to lead the rest home. Brutal, cold, Roman. And yet he was revered. For under his reign, the treasury overflowed, the borders were safe, and the capital gleamed like a second Eden. But Basil died childless, and with him died stability. The emperors who followed were weak. Some ruled through pleasure, others through panic. The court grew fat with intrigue. Generals were ignored. Worse still, one by one, the empire's themes, the local military districts that once guaranteed security, were neglected and sold for favor. Power slipped. To the east, a new storm gathered. The Seljuk Turks. They were not an empire in the Roman sense. They were not builders, not orators, not heirs to Caesar, but they were fast, fierce, and faithful. And they had come to stay. At Manzikert in 1071, the unthinkable happened. A Roman army, led by an emperor, was not just defeated but captured. The emperor was brought in chains before the Turkish Sultan. He was treated with honor, then released. But when he returned to Constantinople, he found no throne waiting, only betrayal. Only chaos. That battle, more than any other, shattered Byzantium's grip on Anatolia. Its heartland, its breadbasket, the very soil where Rome's eastern power had first taken root. Peasants fled, cities fell. And in the vacuum came a new force, not from the east, but from the west. The Crusades. What began as a holy war called by the Pope in Rome to reclaim Jerusalem, soon tangled itself in Byzantine affairs. The emperors, desperate for help, welcomed Western knights into their land. But these knights, bold, proud, ungovernable, saw Constantinople not as a city to honor, but to envy. And the envy festered. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the unthinkable became unbearable. Western Christians, in the name of Christ, turned on Byzantium. They stormed the walls. They shattered the gates. They sacked the city. Churches were looted, altars defiled, sacred relics stolen and shipped west. The Hagia Sophia became a stable. Nuns were dragged through the streets. Monks killed where they knelt. Gold was melted. Statues torn down. Thousands died. It was not the Muslims, not the Persians, not the Goths. It was fellow Christians who brought the Second Rome to its knees. For 57 years, Constantinople was no longer Byzantine. A Latin emperor sat on the throne, but the city bled. And though the empire in exile survived in the shadows in Nicaea, in Trebizond, the light of Byzantium dimmed. And yet, it did not die. In 1261, through cunning and courage, the Byzantines reclaimed their city. But they returned to ruin. The palaces were broken, the population halved, the treasury empty, the armies scattered. They had reclaimed their home, but they could never reclaim their height. The Byzantines returned to their throne, but they returned to shadows. Gone were the parades of a golden age. Now the emperors walked beneath cracked domes and broken banners. They ruled, not an empire, but a memory, clinging to marble walls and fading rituals. Still, they tried. They repaired churches, rebuilt towers, They sent envoys to the West begging for aid, for alliances, for recognition. But Europe had changed. France had kings, England had parliaments. Italy had merchant empires, and they remembered 1204, not with guilt, but with pride. To the east, the Turks had not waited. They grew stronger, bolder, unified under a new force, the Ottomans. They were no longer horse tribes on the edge of the world. They were organized, disciplined, devout. They wanted not tribute, but triumph. The Byzantines watched the map shrink around them. One by one, cities fell. Fortresses surrendered. Anatolia was gone. Thrace was a battlefield. By the 1400s, Constantinople was little more than an island in a sea of enemy banners. The emperor still ruled, but only in name. The people prayed, but fewer and fewer remained. Merchants passed the city by, choosing faster ports, safer seas. Only the churches still whispered of glory, and even they trembled beneath time. Then came Mehmed II, young, brilliant, ruthless. He did not see Constantinople as a city. He saw it as destiny. In 1453, he surrounded the walls. He brought cannons, monsters of iron, built by engineers from the West. Day and night, the ground shook as they fired. Inside, Constantine X, the last Roman emperor, prepared for the end. He had no legions, no fleets, just a few thousand defenders, Greeks, Italians, even a handful of mercenaries who still believed in the old empire. On May 29th, the final assault began. From every direction, the Ottomans stormed the walls. The defenders fought with iron, fire, and faith. But the numbers overwhelmed them. A gate was breached, a chain was broken, and the tide poured in. Constantine removed his imperial cloak, drew his sword, and disappeared into the battle. He died as a Roman should, facing his enemies, not fleeing from them. By noon, it was over. The city that had once defied Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and time itself had fallen. The cross atop Hagia Sophia was torn down. A crescent rose in its place. Church bells fell silent. The muezzin called to prayer. Byzantium was gone, but Rome refused to vanish. And yet, something strange happened. Though the walls had fallen and the last emperor had bled into the soil, Byzantium did not die. Its name vanished from maps, its banners burned, but in silence its soul scattered, like ash on the wind. It settled in the laws of Europe, in the Roman codes that still govern courts from Paris to Washington. Justinian's words, etched into parchment, became the backbone of modern justice. It breathed through the domes of Florence, Vienna, and Moscow. Hagia Sophia inspired architects for centuries. Even the Russians, upon seeing its golden interior, declared, "We did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth." It whispered through the rituals of the Eastern Church. In icons kissed by candlelight, in choirs echoing Byzantine hymns, in the cross traced on foreheads in homes far from Constantinople. It hid in manuscripts. Byzantine monks copied Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, when the West had forgotten them. And when the scholars fled the fallen city, they carried more than relics. They carried the Renaissance on their backs. Even in defeat, the Byzantines planted seeds. They taught the world that power could be sacred, that faith could shape empires, that civilization could be defended with law, art, and spirit, as much as with sword and shield. But perhaps their greatest legacy was survival. No empire lasted as long. Not Babylon, not Athens, not Rome, not the British crown. For over 1,000 years, Byzantium stood at the edge of the known world, holding the line between ancient and modern, east and west, sword and scroll. And in that time, they learned a truth we still chase today, that empires are not built to last, but meaning is. So when you walk through cities with domes, laws, crosses, arches, or Latin names, when you hear echoes of chants, when you see mosaics sparkle in hidden corners of old churches, when you stand in silence before great stone walls, wondering what came before, you are not just remembering Rome, you are walking through Byzantium. It is gone, but it is not lost. Because Byzantium, like all things built with soul, did not need to survive to endure.